Hey, everybody. Welcome back and good afternoon. I hope that you had a nice weekend. It's good to see all of you. Before we begin discussing political parties, I thought it would be useful for us to sort of double back and do a bit of I guess, exploration or sort of an explanation of the examples that I gave you and the scenarios that I put you in when we talked about minority strategy under different levels of party competition. Remember that we were studying intergroup violence and ethnic and religious violence and riots in India, where the Hindu majority carried out numerous attacks against the Muslim minority. And remember that we discovered that some of the conventional explanations for ethnic violence don't hold up because they could only explain the outcome on the national level, and they weren't able to explain variation from state to state. Why, for example, some states had higher levels of ethnic violence in other states had lower levels. So we needed something that was more flexible and some more nuance. So we turned our attention to the level of party competition. And we talked about how different levels of party competition change the incentives faced by political leaders. And in doing so, they change the strategies of the minority groups, or at least the most optimal strategies. So I put you in these scenarios that were designed to teach you these lessons about the role of party competition. And the first scenario was you are a leader of a minority group whose political party has no representatives in your state's legislature. Rumor has it that the majority group plans to attack your group's citizens and property. There is disagreement within your group about how to defend itself. Now, the dilemma arose around the following. Some group leaders advocate a strategy of lobbying the state's governor to use state resources to protect the group from any outbreak of violence. Other group leaders advocate a strategy of forming a group self-defense force. Your support for one strategy or the other will determine the group's course of action. Whose strategy do you support? The lobbyists or the civil defenders, and why? Most of you who responded said that you supported the lobbyists and that you would throw your weight behind that group of leaders and that you would argue for the group to take that approach to defending itself. And I pushed back. I engaged with you and I asked you, well, what if the governor doesn't need your support and doesn't need your votes? And I want to make it a little clearer what the potential consequence of that course of action could be. So, under this set of circumstances where there's a two-party system and your party has no representatives in Congress, if you support the lobbyists and your group devotes its resources to courting the governor may ignore you because they don't need your votes. Uh, and without a self-defense force, you may be left defenseless in the riot that would result. Now, that's a very unfortunate outcome, but that would, in fact, be more likely to result if you made the incorrect decision politically and you chose to lobby the governor as opposed to forming that self-defense force. Now, I know this is very bleak, right? There may be many of you scratching your head and going, is this really where we are? Is this where humanity is? Well, maybe unfortunately, yes. Wilkinson's model suggests that this is the incentive faced by elected leaders under this set of circumstances in India in particular, but really, frankly, anywhere where a minority doesn't have any representatives in the legislature and there's a low level of party competition, as indicated by, for instance, a two-party system. So this is likely to be the result, according to Wilkinson's model and according to Wilkinson's findings. Now, I gave you another. Oh, before we move on and discuss the second scenario that I put you in, let's just take a look in terms of the figure, the theoretical description, where we would be and where we are in this scenario. And we're right here where there are two parties. Now you'll notice that Wilkinson's model allows for the possibility that the government does rely on minority votes, even though there are only two parties and thus a relatively low level of party competition, because theoretically it may be the case that the minority party has one or two representatives in the legislature and they form the outer edge of a government coalition. But the truth is that's unlikely, because in a two-party system with a low level of party competition, it's very likely that the government coalition will simply consist of one party, or one party and a few members of another party. But I already told you that your party has no representatives in the legislature, and so I made it relatively clear that there was very little chance that the government relied on your votes, and therefore that it was quite likely that you should focus on the self-defense force as opposed to lobbying the government. Now, before we continue and before I discuss the second scenario, does anyone object to this reasoning, or does anyone see any flaws in this argumentation or this line of reasoning? I think the thing about politics that I've discovered after many years of studying it is, don't expect it to be pretty. It's really, really ugly, you know? It's actually so much uglier than the smoky rooms in movies even suggest, because the actual incentives in the actual decision making is ugly enough and is unseemly enough. And this example is a good example of that. The idea that the level of party competition and the political incentives would shape a governor's responsiveness to impending violence against a minority group, that's about as unseemly as it comes. But this is politics, and so don't expect it to be pretty. Let's deal with the second scenario that I gave you. And remember that the only piece of information that changed, well, really two pieces of information. First, this is now a four-party system with an effective number of parties of about 4.5. So it's a much larger party system with a higher level of party competition. And I told you that in this scenario, you are a leader of a minority group whose political party has a sizable presence in your state's legislature. Rumor has it that the majority group plans to attack your group's citizens and property. There is disagreement within your group about how to defend itself. Now, the dilemma arises when it becomes clear that some group leaders are advocating a strategy of lobbying the state's governor to use state resources to protect the group from any outbreak of violence. But another group of leaders is advocating a strategy of forming a group self-defense force. Now, your support for one strategy or the other will determine the group's course of action. And at this point, I posed the question, whose strategy do you support? The lobbyists or the civil defenders? And why? And at this stage, many of you had kind of adopted the political logic and you were beginning to reason through that political lens where you're thinking about the political incentives faced by the leaders and you're choosing a strategy based on that. Some of you still chose the other choice. What I was encouraging you to consider is that under this scenario, lobbying the governor might be an especially useful strategy. And the reason has to do with the simple fact that the governor relies on your votes. And so what I suggested to you and what I said is that if you support the defenders and your group opts not to lobby the governor who needs your votes, you are passing up a chance to extract a promise of security in return for your votes. And the defense force cannot ensure security either. So it's actually really quite risky to throw your weight behind the idea for a self-defense force when the political environment is actually favorable to your group lobbying the governor. And so in this circumstance, the most optimal choice is clearly to engage in politics and lobby the governor and try to influence the governor's decision making. And in this regard, your sizable presence in the legislature might become useful, as could the organization of your group's civil and social groups, and perhaps its religious or other organizations. You can imagine a variety of different actors playing a role in perhaps in ideally in unison to lobby a governor so as to prevent or protect that group from violence. And this is precisely what Wilkinson finds, that in those states in India where there's a higher level of party competition, minority groups are able to capitalize and extract a promise of security in return for their votes. They're able to use the political incentives to their advantage. And in this regard, they're quite skillful and they're quite successful and capable at maneuvering politically and using their position to their advantage and using the political environment to their advantage. And so Wilkinson's model then goes a long way in not only explaining the government's response to the minority groups, but in explaining the strategy of the minority groups, and then also in depicting the minority groups as quite skillful politically and capable of maneuvering very, very effectively to use the level of party competition to their advantage. And so that's what's unique and so cool about the model. If you can accept and stomach the sort of cynical nihilistic part that revolves around the incentives of the leaders in the way that really their protection from violence, the minorities that is, depends on those incentives. If you can get by that, it's a model that really it reveals much about the way that political institutions and in politics work. And so in this scenario, this is where we are. We're here in this particular sphere where we have a much higher level of party competition as indicated by the effective number of parties. And in this circumstance, the government relies on your votes. And so it makes much more sense to engage politically and to, avoid forming the self-defense force. Now, there are some bottom lines here that I want to really highlight and emphasize because, as I mentioned, this model is useful because it says so much about politics and because it's so intuitive and yet so simple and so also important in its implications about the political behavior of minorities and groups that historically and traditionally and for the foreseeable future are marginalized and abused by majorities virtually everywhere. So the first bottom line is that the level of party competition predetermines or selects the optimal minority strategy because it shapes the incentives faced by elected leaders. Different strategies follow from different levels of party competition. Because those different levels of competition shape the incentives faced by the leaders, specifically with respect to whose support they do and do not need in order to survive and or be reelected. So in this regard, the political environment will select for them the specific strategy that minority groups should use. And what this means in turn is that minorities cannot afford to be politically disengaged. They have to be even more active and organized than other groups and than ever before, because they must be paying attention to and noticing the level of party competition, their particular position in relation to other parties, their overall strength, and then the universe of possibilities regarding what they can and can't leverage and who does and does not rely on their support in some critical way. And so in this way, Wilkinson demands much of minority groups. And again, I'm going to suggest that this is the case everywhere, not just in India. Minority groups have a particular advantage, or circumstance that they can use to their advantage under certain levels of party competition or in certain circumstances where they become swing votes. And you can see that in the United States as well as in this case India, but under a variety of circumstances, certain minority groups can become swing votes. And so that means in turn that they have to be especially politically engaged. They can't afford to not be engaged. And then the third and final bottom line is an institutional point about the way that the distribution of power regionally selects and determines at what level the particular incentives and strategies will operate. And so if it's a federal system like in India, then party competition at that state level will be important in shaping leaders' incentives and then minority strategies, because they can, for example, leverage their votes in their relationships with governors and through their support in state legislatures. But if it's a unitary state where power is centralized in a central national government and there are no state governments, well then the game changes completely, because now you've got to lobby the executive, the head of government of the entire country, and you need to obtain representation in the national legislature, and your lobbying must be much larger in scope. Of course, it's also possible that if it's a unitary system and jurisdictions differ and the distribution of power is fundamentally different, that there could be less ethnic violence the country over. But that's a counterfactual that we don't know. We don't know. We can't rerun history and create an India that's a unitary state to find out. But my suspicion is that that might change a lot, because when everything is understood in the context of the federal system and on a state level, in the distinctions and the variations are evident on a state by state level, well, then everything is likely to change when it's suddenly the national government that is the center of gravity, so to speak. So this is the completion of our lesson on minority strategy and non-electoral behavior in the case of India in particular, but more generally with regard to non-electoral behavior and strategy during protests and rebellions and forms of political behavior that fall further from voting and in the more traditional forms of behavior that we've already analyzed in the class. This was a unit that was really fun for me because the Wilkinson model was neat to learn from, but I also think that this unit and module produces implications that reach far beyond just India. And I think in the United States, these lessons apply as well. And so, unfortunately, the level of party competition in the United States is quite low, and many would argue that the Democratic Party has insufficient incentives or inadequate incentives to better represent minorities. Some would argue that in fact it's suboptimal, and in the representation enjoyed by minorities through the Democratic Party is not up to standard. This is a long discussion that we could have. I think at this moment we'll leave it here, and we'll just conclude by saying that these lessons apply far and wide. And once again, we can see how basic ideas about power, politics, and institutions help to produce really useful insights that that we can use and practice and hopefully apply in our own circumstances. Now, this is the moment where we pivot and begin to address a new topic. And it's not just a new topic, it's also really a new part in the course. And this part of the course, part two, focuses on parties, political parties. And we are not going to focus on parties in the ways that you might focus on parties in a class on policy and politics, where you focus on policy reform and majorities and the strength of different parties. Instead, we'll focus on things like appeals and issues and campaigns and linkage strategies and the types of approaches that parties take in their effort to win office. Politics, but the kind that they engage in before they're in power, before they're in politics. This is all about the sort of electoral in sort of campaign behavior of political parties. We'll focus a lot on how they try to connect with voters, how they try to appeal to voters, what sorts of strategies they use, and in general, how they go about the business of trying to win office. Because after all, a political party is really defined as a group of people or an organization who seek to win office and who consist of office holders and those who support those who have won office. That's essentially how we understand a political party. And so we'll be studying that component, that electoral behavioral component of parties. And this will be a little bit new for me. I typically have focused more on policy and governing and governance in my research and in my teaching. So I know a lot about how parties behave often in power, especially in democracies and in coalitions, but I don't know as much about their campaigning and their behavioral impulses in elections. And so I'm going to be learning along with you, and I'm just as fascinated by this stuff as you are. So I'm looking forward to learning a great deal in both from you and from the topics that we'll examine and study in the class. So the key questions for us are really three, and these questions are the motivating and sort of animating questions in the literature as well, where the focus on behavior has political scientists focusing on a similar set of questions as those examined when we talk about voters and individuals. So, first and foremost, why do different parties adopt different linkage strategies? For example, programmatic and policy oriented strategies where they promise public goods and investments that will benefit all, versus non programmatic strategies where they deliver private benefits to specific groups of within voters for the purpose of building support in a less programmatic way. These are just examples of different linkage strategies or ways that parties try to build support and generate constituencies. There are some pretty clear differences within countries and from country to country in those strategies. For instance, in developing countries, it's much more common for parties to use non programmatic strategies where they use clientelistic and patron client relationships to generate and build constituencies. In Mexico, for instance, Dominican Republic, these are places where programmatic strategies don't necessarily predominate among parties. Secondarily, why do some parties run on issues while other parties do not? Some political parties, they focus in their campaigns on what they would do in power. We will promote these policies, these reforms. This is our vision of the future. Other parties don't. They don't focus on issues. Instead, they will focus on certain kinds of appeals. In some cases, as we've seen already in places like South Africa, those appeals might be race or group or ethnic appeals. They may focus on rebuttals of the incumbent government in focus on issues of popularity or character. They may focus on rhetoric. Parties can differ a great deal in what they run on and what kinds of campaigns they run. These are important questions. And then thirdly, and maybe most fundamentally, what motivates parties? In general, and maybe most importantly, are they responding to you and I, or are they responding to markets? Are they responding to particular actors or subsets of voters who have disproportionate influence because of their money or their wealth or their power? What is motivating parties, and why do they behave the way they do? Why do they campaign the way they campaign? In this regard, we will focus a little bit on the responsiveness of parties once they're in power, but we won't focus as much on issues and questions of governance and in governing. Instead, we'll focus really mainly on the links in the responsiveness between parties and voters in different types of voters, or in the case of one article, the links between parties and markets and the responsiveness of parties to markets. So this is a different angle for us in the class, and we'll be learning then about the behavior of parties as one type of political actor that is different than voters. Typically, in a comparative political behavior class, you'll focus mainly on voters, and that's fine. We learn a lot about voters, but it's also the case that parties behave politically as well, and we want to understand them as political creatures too. So it made sense to me to focus part of this course on party behavior. Now, I think that the best way for us to get started is by taking on a question that is very simple and that will get us thinking about the relationship between parties and democracy, and the role of parties in democracy, and what parties do or don't do for democracy. And the question is, if parties were banned tomorrow, would it help or hurt democracy? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch a poll, and I can't wait to see what you have to say about this, because I don't know what their response will be. Well, I'm surprised so far. Getting a lot of interesting and in good ideas in the chat, which I'll be happy to share here in a moment as we continue to roll in with the votes. Virtually everyone has voted. One's still out. I'll give us just another second here. This is an interesting question because in some ways, you can see arguments on both sides. All right, so we got almost everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share the results. Take a look, everyone. In response to the question, if parties were banned tomorrow, would it help or hurt democracy? 32 of you, or 86%, a very, very large supermajority, said that it would hurt democracy. 5 of you, or 14%, said that it would help democracy. This is an interesting question because I think that you can make arguments on both sides, really. And there's, perhaps a debate here. But before I consider and incorporate some of the insights shared in the chat, can we just discuss this for a moment and kind of step back? Those of you who said that if parties were banned tomorrow, it would help democracy, can you share your reasoning or why you think that might be the case?
I can share. I picked it, well, if there was like an other or an I don't know option, I would probably would have picked that one. But I considered, how in the US we have a two-party system, and in my opinion, um, making people pick, Democratic or Republican kind of hinders like anything in between or any like differing opinions. So I think in the US, um, it would encourage people to um, kind of like be, just not pick one of the two.
I see. So Edna, for you, it sounds like if we can only have two parties, you would rather have no parties, but maybe most um, ideally you would like to have like three or four or five or just more than two.
Yeah, I think that there's in other countries like we see like there's space for other parties, and so I think in the US, yeah.
Definitely, I see that reasoning for sure. Does anyone else want to comment on why banning parties tomorrow might help democracy?
Um, in the poll, I can share. I said that it would help democracy, but then I do also see like why there are, points for each side because I mentioned in my comment like how George Washington and the Federalist Papers warned us about, the formation of political parties and factions and seeing how it would like hurt democracy. And I think that that's pretty valid. And then seeing as we have the two-party political system in the US, it kind of like is a it's a one or the other type of choice with voters. And I think it kind of dumbs it down in a way to where um, the parties have kind of just taken on ideologies into where citizens and voters are now able to just say, okay, well, I sided with this political party, so I'm just going to vote this way on this issue. When rather you would have a more informed, voter base if it was policy based rather than focused on ideologies and political parties. So I feel like more so it would I feel like it would be a lot of chaos if we were to just ban it tomorrow. But then in the long run, I feel like voters would need to take their opinions and information into their own hands, and then it would, formulate a better democracy, hopefully. But then also going off of Edna's point, I think if we are going to have political parties, having more representation and having multiple parties would be more beneficial, seeing as the two, big kind of political parties right now just um kind of I guess I don't know the word, but they just consume everything. They basically just take up new ideologies or new policies and then make that a part of their thing rather than making a smaller political party and then having more representation in that manner. So yeah.
Thank you, Kyrie. Would anyone else like to comment on if parties were banned tomorrow, whether it would help or hurt democracy? We've heard a couple different points that would support, perhaps removing parties. Can someone make an argument or talk about why the reverse might be true, why it might hurt democracy?
If I may,
Yes, of course, Orlando.
I was thinking I actually voted for her, but more so in the long run, thinking that it would help. If it were to be as of tomorrow, as the questioner, I guess the present day, democracy or parties were banned, I think it hurt due to the fact of high tensions, especially I'm thinking about the country itself, what we just recently came out of, and other, I guess, other moments where parties themselves, like I think about like so the parties right now are consistent of a majority. And since these majority individuals happen to be arguing the most and having to have this power and this platform to be arguing, minorities or other people who don't necessarily agree with a lot of, again, this is what I thought Kyrie touched upon really, really well, and so did Edna, and the fact that we had multiple other parties, smaller, but also more in tune and in touch with the type of messages and ideas of the people that they're trying to say, instead of, I guess, adding them onto themselves and saying, like, slapping it onto them and being like, oh yeah, this is what we do too, but genuinely out of like root within like the party itself is a genuine concern for it, then I feel like that would be like, that would change the whole party system itself. But it would hurt because, again, these parties, and especially within, like, I, again, thinking about like the United States, and other countries similar to like the same tensions, these people constantly, these parties allow for people to have arguments safely, I'd say. So if they were to be dismantled, it'd be a free for all in a lot of ways for those people who can easily just to pick a side and be like, oh, I wouldn't want to be part of the other one, I guess. Meanwhile, there's a lot of people who may compromise on the decisions on party support.
Okay, thank you, Orlando. Can we hear from some others? Would anyone else like to share their point of view about why it might help or hurt democracy? So Collins said, I feel like banning parties would silence the minority and always give the majority power. But if there are no parties, it might be more difficult to form those majorities because typically party labels and associations help us to understand patterns of government in opposition or support and opposition. But I understand, Collins. I think that it may be true that political parties help to promote the interests of minorities and represent interests of minorities, but that may depend also on the level of party competition. Like we just saw in India, for example, minority groups in states in India with lower levels of party competition don't have much representation and don't have much protection from violence in particular because they don't have a voice and because they don't have influence and because the incentives lead elected leaders to ignore them. I think if the level of party competition is higher, many of those benefits of parties that you discuss when you talk about perhaps protecting minorities do begin to obtain. It's just that we need to have higher levels of party competition. Here in the United States, we have low levels of party competition. As Kyrie pointed out, there's really a monopoly, right? The Republicans and the Democrats have a monopoly on politics. And in that regard, they kind of play as gatekeepers. They sort of consume and absorb a lot and leave virtually no space for other parties to become viable. Of course, our institutions, our electoral system, our majoritarian institutions, our first past the post, winner take all system is a big part of that. It's difficult to know if we should blame the players or if we should blame the game, right? Do we blame the parties or do we blame the institutions? It's really a chicken or egg thing, right? But thank you, Collins, for sharing that. And thank you, Kyrie, for your commentary as well. Brittany says, I said it would hurt because ultimately people use parties as heuristics that help unsophisticated voters make choice that align with their ideals. Good point, Brittany. Also, although I do agree that I could probably argue either way on this issue. And that's the key, right? Seeing that there may be some valid arguments on both sides, but Brittany makes a really good point, which is that, look, voters use parties as a heuristic when they go to the polls and vote, and turnout and attachments to parties, moreover, all in some ways depend on parties and parties when it comes to their mobilization, as well as their efforts to create certain constituencies. It's also the fact, as I mentioned earlier in the semester, in new democracies in particular, an indicator of the strength of the democracy is often the rate of party attachment, the proportion of voters who feel an attachment or an association with a given party. It's considered an early sign of institutionalization. In Brittany makes an interesting point that's very consistent with this finding in this use of party attachment as a sign of institutionalization, when Brittany says that voters use these parties as heuristics or as signals. Chandon says, I was thinking in the sense that if we do ban democracy or parties, I think Chandon means, it would lead to a more authoritarian rule. But again, it comes down to how we choose to go down the path of how to lead a country. But I also agree that we could look at the other side of this coin and see how we could give opportunity to smaller groups to step up and voice their opinions. Now, Chandon makes a really important and interesting point, which is, well, how might that affect politics? Would that make politics more or less democratic? I'd like to talk more about that in a moment. This is something that's essential, and I'd like you to consider for a moment that as much as we dislike parties and as stuck as we feel with them, especially in the United States, they actually potentially serve a vitally important function. And I'll explain and identify that in a moment, especially in the context of a democracy. But Chandon is onto something here, and you're all onto something, but there's a piece of something there, a thread that we're going to pull and just yank and try to unfurl, and so that we can take a closer look, because there's something there that's incredibly important. Jacqueline says, I feel that it would hurt the democracy because then everyone would have scattered ideals trying to run for Congress. There'd be less organization, right? Party structure politics. With having parties, there's like a spectrum of where people agree that they can feel affiliated or not at all. If they don't feel that they belong, there's always the option to be independent. To be sure, and even being an independent is always understood in relation to parties. Jacqueline points out that parties play an important role in organizing politics in this way. And for you and I, if you're a political science major especially, politics might mean a lot to you, and you might pay a lot of attention to politics, or probably more attention than most people, even most people who vote. Those people who pay less attention, they may rely more on parties than you do, for example, to get information or to make decisions or to organize and understand and interpret information and what's happening. In that case, in that regard, the role of parties can be really important. And maybe in this sense, the informational component that we've already discussed in the class becomes especially relevant. The sheer fact that the way that people interpret information often depends a lot on their partisanship. Virginia says, while I see both sides, I was thinking of the issues along the lines of multi-party system, and equally what this week's articles was about, that most parties are formed by voters' own incentives, and this would really affect the length of the policies passed. Also, how this would affect party actors, party office members in really long term. And also, would parties be more stable? So Virginia is suggesting that, well, if parties are a reflection of the incentives and the preferences of voters, maybe parties matter a lot, and maybe parties then are an important sort of institutionalization or codification, if you will, or materialization of those preferences. And maybe we need them because in the absence of parties, voters have less influence. Perhaps Virginia also suggests that maybe the system is more stable. The point that I'd like to make before we continue, and that is consistent with Chandon's point and with much of what you've said, everyone, is that, look, as much as we dislike parties, they're really important, and here's why. Because parties weaken the rule of elites. All societies have their elites. It's just that from society to society, the institutions differ. And parties are one of the institutions that can weaken and work against the arbitrary expressions of power of society's most powerful individuals and personalities. Parties matter a great deal because they are not individuals. Parties, by definition, are organizations. And organizations have their own internal politics and systems and processes, but they function in a way that weakens the influence in the rule of individual people, individuals. Democracy is about dispersing power and creating channels to participation, in creating equality between participants. It's about interrupting concentrations of power that might exist on their own in society. Without political parties, individuals take their place. Individuals fill the space. They fill the power vacuum that political parties fill. If parties are gone, individuals take their place, and we wind up with authoritarian rule because we don't have organizations or structures or political institutions that can work against them and restrain them and hold them back and militate against their worst impulses. Now, it's not necessarily the case that you'll always wind up with authoritarian rule. I'm just speaking in the abstract. I'm saying that theoretically, in the absence of parties, you're more likely to wind up with authoritarian rule, because authoritarian rule is by definition the concentration of power in the hands of a narrow group or a single individual. Parties disperse power by definition. And so parties in this regard can promote democracy. Of course, it's also the case that parties can be low quality democratic institutions, and the quality of the representation can suck. And the institutions of the electoral system can also affect the quality of the representation and the extent to which parties represent in particular minority groups. That's a separate question, though. In general, parties do promote democracy if we accept the simple fact that political institutions, and good ones, will effectively restrain the arbitrary expressions of power of elites. They will restrain the rule of the elites. They will weaken the rule of the elites. But there are some places in the world where parties are banned and where they don't exist, and where the system functions on some other basis. I'm actually from a place, Nebraska, where there are no parties. In the state legislature, there is a no party rule or law. It's nonpartisan, and so it's mainly, operates on the basis of ideology, but they're supposed to be nonpartisan, and it's supposed to change decision making. Nunavut is a province in Canada where they also have no parties. They call it a consensus government. It's just interesting to consider for a moment what politics looks like without parties, especially if we accept that they probably serve some important functions in a democracy, especially. Here at the end of class, let's just take a moment and see what this is all about.
I witnessed as he strode across the floor with anger fierce in his eyes and face.
You won't see this in the Nunavut legislature. So what is consensus government? The main characteristic? There are no political parties. Our consensus-style government is closer to the traditional way Inuit made decisions, with listening, cooperation, and respect. Inuit make up 85% of Nunavut's population. Nunavut is here, in Canada's Arctic. It's the newest territory, with 25 communities spread out over 1/5 of Canada's landmass, none of which are connected by roads to each other or southern Canada. In an election, candidates run as independents. A few weeks later, the new members of the Legislative Assembly meet for a public forum. That's when they elect from among themselves a speaker, a premier, and cabinet ministers. It's all done by secret ballot. Then the premier assigns portfolios to the cabinet ministers. The premier and the cabinet then act like the governing party, with the rest of the MLAs acting as the official opposition. When the legislature sits, bills can only pass with a majority vote. Regular MLAs can vote any way they like, but cabinet is expected to vote together. In this system, there are more regular MLAs than cabinet members. What stands out with a consensus government? It's often more civil than the party system. There's rarely any shouting or heckling. But with no parties, MLAs are more likely to tackle really local issues like paving roads or municipal services, and not broader Nunavut issues like cost of living or mental health. Bringing the party system to Nunavut has been discussed, but the consensus is, consensus stays.
So parties don't exist everywhere. That's the point. But in some ways, the video also proves the rule. Parties do predominate in most places, and especially at the national level, where politics is fundamentally organized on the basis of political parties. And for good or for ill, we are basically stuck with them for now. But while we're stuck with them, we will study how they behave and how they campaign and how they connect to voters and how they build constituencies and what sorts of appeals and issues they do or do not make. And so all of that and more on Wednesday. I look forward to seeing you again, but thanks for being here today, and I'll see you on Wednesday.